He saved her life and walked back into the snow like he was nobody. But somebody saw him. And that somebody had the power to turn his quiet, ordinary world into a battlefield he never signed up for. If you've ever wondered what happens when the most powerful woman in the country can't stop thinking about the one man who didn't want anything from her, stay until the end, like this video, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The storm came in fast that Friday. By 6 in the evening, the Weather Service had upgraded the advisory to a full blizzard warning for the Aspen Ridge Mountain Corridor, and the Whitmore Grand, the most expensive resort in 3 states, had sealed its lobby doors against a wind that howled down from the peaks like something that had been waiting up there all winter for an excuse to come down. Inside, the chandeliers swayed almost imperceptibly. The floor staff pretended not to notice. Landon Hayes noticed. He stood at the far end of the mezzanine bar, nursing a glass of whiskey he'd barely touched, watching the windows flex against the gusts, and wondering, not for the first time, why he'd let Marcus talk him into this. Marcus Chen, his co-worker and the closest thing Landon had to a best friend, had booked the weekend as a birthday surprise. "You never go anywhere, man. 4 years, Landon. You've earned 1 night away." And Landon had said yes, mostly because he didn't have the energy to argue, and because Sophie was spending the weekend with her grandparents, and because the apartment felt like a different kind of cold when she wasn't in it. He wasn't rich enough to be here. That was the plain truth of it. A night at the Whitmore Grand cost more than he made in a week installing HVAC systems, and Marcus had gotten some kind of deal through a client connection, and even then Landon had quietly transferred his half of the room cost with a stomach clench he was trying to ignore. He didn't belong in a place where the napkins were folded into swans and the bartenders knew 17 words for the same drink. But he was here. So he stood at the bar in the one decent blazer he owned, dark navy, bought 3 years ago for a job interview, and watched the storm and sipped his whiskey and tried to feel like a person who deserved a night off. Marcus had gone to find a bathroom 20 minutes ago and had not returned, which probably meant he'd gotten talking to someone. Marcus could talk to anyone. It was his defining characteristic and also, at moments like this, his most irritating one. The main hall of the resort was configured around a sweeping open-floor ballroom that connected to 3 separate dining wings, and on this particular Friday evening, the largest of those wings, the Meridian Room, had been reserved for what the hotel's event board described only as a private corporate engagement. Landon had noticed the security detail when he checked in, men in dark suits standing at angles that were too deliberate to be casual, earpieces catching the light. He'd assumed it was a politician. The Whitmore Grand attracted that type. He was finishing the last of his whiskey when he heard it. Not a scream. Something worse, a sudden collective held breath from the direction of the Meridian Room, followed by the particular kind of commotion that happens when a group of controlled professional people lose their composure at the same moment. Chairs scraping, voices rising, glass shattering. Landon set his drink down. He moved toward the sound without thinking about it, the same way he'd once moved toward a flipped vehicle on I-70 while other drivers slowed and stared. It wasn't heroism, it was something more like reflex, the inability to stay still when something needed doing. The doors to the Meridian Room were still open. The security men were converging from both sides of the hall, but Landon was closer, and he went through first. What he saw was this: a long table set with crystal and white linen, maybe 40 guests in formal wear, half of them on their feet. A woman on the floor. 2 men crouched beside her who clearly had no idea what they were doing. One was patting her hand, the other was shouting her name. A third man stood slightly apart from the group, watching, and something about the way he was watching, too still, too controlled, registered in the back of Landon's mind, and then got filed away because there were more pressing things. He crossed the room in 10 strides, dropped to his knees beside her, and took over. She was unconscious, late 20s, early 30s, dark hair spread across the floor. She'd gone down hard. He could see the bruise already forming at her temple from where she'd caught the table edge on the way down. Her color was off. Breathing, but shallow and irregular, with a kind of glassy quality to her skin that didn't belong to simple fainting. "Has she taken anything?" Landon asked. "Any medications? Alcohol?" The man who'd been patting her hand, 50s, silver-haired, the kind of jawline that came from years of photographs, looked at Landon like he'd materialized from nowhere. "Who are you?" "Is there a doctor in the room?" Landon asked the room at large, not the silver-haired man, because the silver-haired man was not going to be useful. Silence. "Of course." "Call 911, Landon said, already checking her airway, tilting her head back with 2 fingers beneath her chin. "Right now. Tell them suspected poisoning. Give them the address." He pulled back the hair from her face. Her eyes were partially open, the irises rolled slightly upward, and her lips had a faint bluish cast that he didn't like at all. "Her lips are cyanotic. Someone get me her purse, her phone, anything that lists medications." "She doesn't take medications," said a woman's voice, younger, controlled but barely, coming from somewhere to his left. "She's healthy. She had 2 glasses of wine over 4 hours. She doesn't get drunk." "I know she doesn't," Landon said. "That's why I said poisoning. Does she have any known allergies, any cardiac history?" "Not that I know of." A pause. "None." The woman on the floor made a sound then, a low, broken sound that was half breath and half something that might have been an attempt at speech. Her fingers moved against the floor. "Hey." Landon leaned closer. "You're okay. I've got you. Help's coming." Her eyes moved, unfocused. He wasn't sure she heard him. "Stay with me," he said, and it came out quieter than he intended, less like a command and more like a request. "Come on, stay here." The security team arrived 30 seconds later, and they were competent. 2 of them clearly had medical training, and they moved in with purpose. Landon stood back and let them work. He answered their questions, timeline, symptoms, what he'd observed. A hotel doctor arrived 2 minutes after that with a kit, and someone said the ambulance was 7 minutes out. She was conscious by the time the paramedics came through the door. Not alert, not oriented, but conscious, eyes open, tracking, responding when they spoke to her. Her color was coming back. Whatever was in her system was moving through at a speed that suggested it hadn't been enough to kill her, just enough to drop her. Landon stood at the edge of the room and watched them load her onto the stretcher, and he felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was tight. He looked around for Marcus, didn't see him, and decided he needed air. He was in the elevator heading back to the 9th floor when he realized he'd left his jacket, the navy blazer, the only decent one he owned, on the back of a chair near the bar. He considered going back for it, decided against it. He was tired in a way that went bone deep, and all he wanted was to call Sophie, hear her voice, go to sleep. He did not give his name to anyone. He did not speak to the security team again. He went upstairs, sat on the edge of the hotel bed in the dark, called his daughter's phone, and listened to her tell him about the snow and the movie she and her grandmother were watching, and he laughed at the right places and said goodnight and love you and hung up. Then he sat in the dark for a while, not sleeping. He found out the next morning, over bad hotel coffee and a news alert on his phone, that the woman's name was Ariana Sterling. He knew the name. Most people in the country did. Ariana Sterling, founder and CEO of Stellarian Technologies, a company worth somewhere north of $40 billion that made the software infrastructure that ran half the world's cloud networks. She was 30 years old. She appeared on magazine covers. She had been profiled in publications that Landon had never read, but had seen on coffee tables in office waiting rooms. She was, by any measurable standard, one of the most powerful people in American business. He stared at the news alert for a moment. Then he finished his coffee, packed his bag, and drove home through roads still half buried in snow. The apartment was a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building in Dunmore that had been built in the mid-'80s and had not been significantly updated since. The carpet in the hallway needed replacing. The water heater occasionally made a sound like a man clearing his throat. Landon had lived here for 3 years since he'd sold the house after Claire died, because the house had too many rooms and he was not good at being alone in many rooms. Sophie came home Sunday evening with her grandmother's cooking packed into a set of containers and her backpack bursting with the particular kind of energy that accumulated over a weekend free from school. She was 8 years old and small for her age, and she had her mother's eyes, which were gray-green and direct, and occasionally made Landon feel like he was being very calmly assessed. "Dad," she said, setting her backpack down in the exact wrong, so he had to step around it. Grandma says you went to a fancy hotel. I did. Was it nice? Landon thought about the chandelier swaying in the storm, the woman on the floor. It was interesting. That means no, Sophie said, with the certainty of someone who had spent 8 years reading his evasions and went to put her containers in the refrigerator. He made hot chocolate while she told him about her weekend in that elliptical associative way she had, jumping from the movie to a fight she'd had with her grandmother's neighbor's dog to a question about whether fish could feel embarrassed. And he stirred and nodded and asked the right questions, and the apartment felt warm in the way it only did when she was in it. Later, after she was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside him and his phone face down on the table, and he thought about Ariana Sterling and her lips going blue and the sound she'd made on the floor of the Meridian room. And he wondered if she was all right, and then he thought, she's Ariana Sterling. She has the best medical care in the country. She's fine. He went to bed. On Tuesday morning, his phone started ringing with numbers he didn't recognize, and it didn't stop. He ignored the first 4 calls. The 5th one was a voicemail from a reporter at a national outlet, and when he listened to it, the words Aspen Ridge and Whitmore Grand and medical emergency appeared in quick succession, and he deleted it before it finished. He ignored the 6th call and the 7th. He texted Marcus, "Did you talk to anyone about Friday?" Marcus texted back almost immediately, "No, why? I didn't even know what happened until I came back and you were upstairs. Are you on the news?" He turned the news on. There was a brief, shaky video, someone's phone shot from across the Meridian room, that showed the back of a man's head and shoulders as he crouched beside a woman on the floor, working with the calm efficiency of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The man's face wasn't visible. The quality was poor. But the hotel had cameras, and apparently someone had talked, and a reporter was now standing outside the Whitmore Grand in a parka, informing viewers that an anonymous bystander, described by witnesses as a man in his early to mid-30s, dark hair, average height, a navy blazer, had been the first to respond to the emergency and had potentially saved the life of Stellarian CEO Ariana Sterling. Landon turned the television off. He called his boss, told him he was coming in early, and spent the rest of the day on a commercial job site in the north end of the city, running ductwork with his crew and thinking about nothing except the work in front of him. The calls stopped after 3 days. He thought that was the end of it. He was wrong. It was a Thursday evening, almost 2 weeks after Aspen Ridge, when the woman appeared at his apartment door. She was not Ariana Sterling. He would have recognized her. She was in her 40s, Asian American, short hair, dressed in a jacket and slacks that said money without trying to announce it. She held an envelope. "Mr. Hayes," she said. It wasn't a question. He stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame. From behind him came the sound of the television. Sophie was watching something, the volume slightly too high the way she always had it when she thought he wasn't going to notice. "I don't know what you're selling," Landon said, "but I'm not interested." "I'm not selling anything." The woman's voice was measured, professional. "My name is Diana Chow. I'm the chief of staff for Ariana Sterling. Ms. Sterling would like to speak with you." He looked at the envelope. "What's that?" "A letter. From her." He didn't take it. "How did you find my address?" "Ms. Sterling employed a private investigator." A brief pause. "I understand that's probably not what you want to hear." "No," Landon said, "it's not." "She's aware of that. The letter explains, I don't need a letter." He wasn't angry, exactly. Tired, mostly. Tired in the way he got when the world decided to remind him that privacy was a luxury. "I'm not interested in speaking with Ms. Sterling. I didn't help her because I wanted anything from it. I helped her because it was the right thing to do. That's it. That's the whole story." Diana Chow looked at him for a moment. She had the kind of face that gave very little away. "The letter isn't an offer of payment," she said. "It's a request. And she wanted you to know," and I'm quoting directly, "tell him I'm not going to make this weird." A pause. Her words, not mine. Despite himself, Landon almost smiled. He didn't take the letter, but he said, "Give me a number." He thought about it for 2 days before he called. Sophie asked him, on the second night, why he kept looking at his phone like it had said something rude to him. He told her he was expecting a work call. She gave him the gray-green assessment eyes and said, "Okay, Dad," in a tone that made it clear she did not believe him, and went back to her homework. He called at 7:30 on a Saturday evening when Sophie was asleep. It rang twice. "Landon Hayes," said the voice on the other end. And it was not a question, the same way Mr. Hayes at his door had not been a question, but it was different, more direct, less formal, with a quality of actual curiosity underneath the words. "Ms. Sterling," he said. "Ariana." A beat. "You can call me Ariana." "All right." A pause. Not awkward, more like she was giving him room. "I wanted to say thank you," she said. "In person would have been better, but you've made that complicated." "I didn't do it for a thank you." "I know that. That's kind of the whole reason I tracked you down." She paused again. He could hear faint background noise on her end, the sound of a large, quiet space. Most people who do something like that want something. You walked out in the middle of a blizzard. You didn't even leave your name. "My jacket was the only thing I left behind, and I didn't go back for that either." "We found it," she said. "Diana has it. We can get it back to you. Don't worry about the jacket." "It's a nice jacket." "It's really not." Something shifted in the quality of the silence on her end, and he realized she was trying not to laugh. "Okay," she said. "Fine, we'll throw the jacket away. Can I ask you something, Mr. Hayes?" "Landon." "Landon." She said it differently than Diana had. "Why did you leave? Afterward? Before the paramedics could even get your name?" He thought about how to answer that. He thought about Sophie asleep in her bed and the hot chocolate and the gray-green eyes and the apartment with its bad carpet and the space in the world that he'd built around his daughter because it was the only space that felt real anymore. "Because I had somewhere to be," he said finally, "and because it wasn't about me." Another silence. Longer this time. "I'd like to meet you," Ariana said. "Not for a photo. Not for a press release, just, I'd like to meet the person who did what you did." He should have said no. That would have been the clean answer. He had a life that was carefully calibrated. Work, Sophie, the fragile architecture of a routine that held them both together, and inviting a billionaire tech mogul into the middle of it was not a sound decision. "I have a daughter," he said. 8 years old. I can't just—" "Bring her," Ariana said. He blinked. "What?" "If she wants to come. I'm not going to pressure you." A pause. "I'm not actually as intimidating as the news coverage suggests. I'll reserve judgment on that." "Fair." He said he'd think about it. He hung up and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark, and he thought about the way she'd sounded. Not like a CEO, not like a public figure, just like a person talking. And he thought about the sound she'd made on the floor of the Meridian room when her fingers moved, and something complicated happened in his chest that he decided not to examine closely. He fell asleep with his phone still in his hand. They met on a Tuesday afternoon 3 days later at a coffee shop near Dunmore Park. It was Landon's choice. Neutral ground, public, 15 minutes from his apartment. He told Sophie only that they were meeting someone he'd helped a while back. She accepted this without much comment, which either meant she believed him or had decided to let it go. He spotted Ariana before she saw him. She was in a corner booth, no entourage, no security visible, though he suspected the man at the counter reading a newspaper was not actually reading a newspaper. She was in dark jeans and a gray sweater, her hair pulled back, and she looked nothing like the photographs. Smaller, maybe. Less polished. There was something around her eyes that the photographs never showed. A tiredness that she wore the way you wear something you've gotten so used to that you've stopped noticing its weight. She looked up when they came through the door. He watched her look at Sophie first, and something crossed her face that he couldn't quite name. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition of something she hadn't been prepared for. She stood up. "Hi," she said, and then looked down at Sophie. "You must be Sophie." Sophie, to her credit, was not visibly intimidated by anything. "You were the lady who got sick," she said. Ariana blinked, glanced at Landon. "She keeps up with the news," he said, which was not entirely accurate but was the most diplomatic available framing. "I was," Ariana said. Your dad helped me. Sophie considered this with the full weight of her 8-year. He's good at that, she said finally, and slid into the booth with the confidence of someone who had made her assessment and was satisfied with the outcome. Landon sat across from Ariana. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, like she was recalibrating something. She's great, Ariana said quietly. Yeah, he said, I know. The coffee arrived. Sophie ordered hot chocolate with a double shot of whipped cream and the efficiency of someone who had been to this coffee shop before, which she had. And Ariana watched this transaction with something that looked genuinely amused. Not performed, not PR ready, just actual amusement. Can I ask you something? Ariana said to Sophie. Sure, said Sophie. Does your dad always rush toward emergencies like that? Sophie looked at her father, considered. One time a car ran a red light and hit a guy on a bike on our street, and Dad ran out in his socks, she said. And one time there was a fire in the building next door, and he went in before the firefighters got there because Mrs. Kowalski on the 3rd floor can't walk very fast. A pause. He always says he just happened to be there, but I think that's not true. Landon said nothing. Ariana looked at him. Just happened to be there, she said. It's a coincidence, he said. I'm a coincidence. She didn't look like she believed him, but she let it go. They talked. Not about the Meridian Room, not about the investigation or the photographs or any of it. Sophie asked Ariana what she did, and Ariana explained Stellarian in terms that were simultaneously accurate and child-accessible. And Sophie said that sounded like a lot of computers, and Ariana said it was in fact a very large number of computers. And Sophie said that seemed lonely, and the table went quiet for a moment. It can be, Ariana said. Later, on the walk home, Sophie slipped her hand into Landon's and said, She seemed sad. He looked down at her. What makes you say that? Her eyes, Sophie said simply, and then started talking about something else. He walked home through the cold with his daughter's hand in his, and he thought about Ariana Sterling's eyes and the tiredness they carried and the way she'd said it can be, without any of the defensive armor that people usually reached for when a child accidentally hit something true. He thought about it for a long time after Sophie was in bed. He didn't try to think about it less. She called him that evening. He picked up on the second ring, which surprised him because he hadn't decided to. I wanted to say, she started, you don't have to. Landon. A breath. Let me say the thing. Okay. Thank you. Not just for the Meridian Room, for today. I don't... A pause, and the pause had texture, had something in it that sounded like it had been pressed flat and was trying to expand. I don't usually feel like a person. When I walk into a room, I feel like a title. I felt like a person today. He didn't have an answer for that right away. Sophie tends to have that effect, he said finally. A long pause. Yeah, she said. I think it was both of you. He looked out the kitchen window at the street below, at the dark and the cold and the yellow circles of the streetlights in the snow. Ariana. He said her name deliberately, the way she'd asked. Are you safe? A silence that lasted just a half beat too long. Of course, she said. He knew what a half beat too long sounded like. He'd had 4 years of practice reading silences. Okay, he said, because pushing was not the right move, not yet. Good. Good night, Landon. Good night. He sat in the kitchen after he hung up, and the coffee shop came back to him. Ariana, watching Sophie explain something elaborate about the nutritional value of whipped cream, with the absolute focus of someone who was not used to being in a room where the agenda was simply being there, and the tiredness around her eyes, and how for a few hours it had softened. Not disappeared, but softened. He thought about the man who had been watching too carefully in the Meridian Room, the one who'd stood apart. He thought about what Ariana had almost said when he asked if she was safe. He got up, rinsed his cup, and stood at the sink for a while, listening to the building settle in the cold. Something was wrong in her world. He didn't know what yet, but he knew the feeling of something being wrong in a way that the person inside it couldn't see clearly, and he knew that he had already, without quite deciding to, started paying attention. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. Outside, the snow was starting up again, light and steady, the kind that didn't announce itself. the kind that you only noticed once it had already covered everything. She was released from the hospital 36 hours after the Meridian Room. The official statement from Stellarian's communications team described it as a brief medical episode stemming from an adverse reaction to a dietary supplement, which was a sentence that had been constructed very carefully by people whose job was constructing sentences carefully and which contained exactly zero accurate information. Ariana read it on her phone from the back of her car, while Diana sat beside her with a tablet and a list of 17 things that required immediate attention. "I need 20 minutes, Ariana said. "You have 3. "Diana." Diana looked up from the tablet. She had been with Ariana for 6 years, since before Stellarian was worth anything close to what it was worth now, and she had seen her boss through negotiations, board coups, a federal investigation that turned out to be nothing, and 2 separate incidents involving paparazzi and a broken umbrella. She knew when Ariana needed 3 minutes and when she needed 20. She closed the tablet. 20 minutes, she said. "I'll be outside." Ariana sat in the back of the car while the city moved past the windows, and she tried to think clearly, which was harder than usual because her head still ached and her hands felt slightly wrong, like the nerve endings hadn't fully come back online yet. The doctors had been careful with their language in the same way the communications team had been careful with its language. What they'd actually told her, in a private room with the door closed, was that the toxicology panel showed a sedative compound at a concentration that was, and the physician had paused here, inconsistent with accidental ingestion. Someone had put it in her drink. She knew this. She had known it on the floor of the Meridian Room, in the fraction of a second before her vision went, when she'd had a sudden crystalline thought that had nothing to do with her body failing and everything to do with the fact that the last thing she'd drunk was the glass of mineral water that Marcus Vale, Stellarian's chief operating officer, her COO, her co-founder of 8 years, had brought her from the bar. She'd sat with that thought for 36 hours in a hospital room, and she hadn't told anyone yet. She wasn't ready to say it out loud because saying it out loud meant it was real. And once it was real, there was no space for the possibility that she was wrong. She stared out the car window. The city was wet and gray, slick with the kind of January cold that never quite committed to proper snow, just delivered steady, miserable, freezing rain instead. She thought about the man who had left his jacket. She'd asked Diana about him before she'd asked about the toxicology report. Diana, who was professionally unflappable, had lifted one eyebrow approximately 2 millimeters, which for Diana was the equivalent of a dramatic reaction. "His name is Landon Hayes," Diana had said. 32, HVAC technician, Dunmore neighborhood, single father, 1 daughter, 8 years old. A pause. "His wife died 4 years ago, cardiac event. She was 28. Ariana had taken that in. "Did he take any of the hotel's contact information? Ask about compensation? Talk to the press?" "No, no, and no. The hotel has him on CCTV going directly to the elevator. He didn't speak to security, management, or medical staff after the initial response. He checked out the next morning." "And the calls? When his name got out?" "He ignored every one of them." Ariana had looked at the ceiling of her hospital room for a while after that. "He left his jacket." "We have it," Diana said. "Don't throw it away." "I wasn't planning to." She thought about him now, in the car, not the way she thought about business problems or strategic moves, not the analytical turn her mind usually took, but something less organized than that, something closer to the feeling she got looking at a math problem she couldn't solve, the certainty that there was an answer, and the frustration of not being able to see it yet. He had rushed toward her collapse in a room full of people who stood still. He had done what needed doing, and then disappeared into a blizzard without looking back. She couldn't account for him. He didn't fit any category she knew. "Okay," she said to the empty back seat. "Find him." Man. Diana found him in 4 days, which was slightly longer than it should have taken and slightly shorter than Ariana had expected, given how thoroughly Landon Hayes appeared to have avoided leaving any kind of footprint. He had no social media. His phone number was unlisted. The trail to his address ran through his employer, through a building permit application, and finally through a utility account that had taken a surprisingly long time to surface. The fact that he was this difficult to find for someone with Ariana's resources told her something about him. She wasn't sure yet what it told her, but she filed it. She wrote the letter herself, which Diana noted without comment. It took 4 drafts. The first 3 sounded like press releases. The fourth sounded like a person, which was what she'd been going for. She did not offer him money. She knew, with the particular instinct she'd developed over years of reading people, that offering money would close the door. Whatever Landon Hayes was, he wasn't that kind of person. He'd proven that already. What she wanted was simpler and harder to ask for. She wanted to look at him. She wanted to understand what it was that made a person do what he'd done the way he'd done it, with that particular quality of attention, the kind that didn't ask for an audience, that didn't perform itself. She also, beneath the rational accounting of it, just wanted to say thank you in a way that meant something. Not a statement, not a donation, just words from one person to another. It was harder to arrange than a board meeting, but it happened. Yishim. She thought about the coffee shop for days after. Not the thank you part, which had gone roughly as she'd hoped. Not even Sophie, though Sophie had stayed with her. The gray-green eyes and the unguarded certainty. The way the girl had looked at her and said she seemed sad, apparently right in front of her. The way 8-year-olds did because they hadn't yet learned the social contract that required everyone to pretend they hadn't noticed. That had lodged somewhere Ariana wasn't expecting. What she kept coming back to was Landon himself. She'd prepared for a version of him that matched the profile. Working man, modest, probably a little uncomfortable in the presence of serious money, maybe quietly hoping she'd offer something. She'd built a mental picture from Diana's summary and from the blurry hotel footage and from the jacket hanging in Diana's office. The actual Landon Hayes had arrived in that jacket, the one she'd been told they'd retrieved. And yes, it really wasn't a very impressive jacket. He'd been right about that. And he had not been uncomfortable, and he had not been hoping for anything. He had been watchful, the way she imagined a person who'd spent years being the only safety net for someone else might be watchful. He watched the room when he sat down. Not paranoid, but present, taking inventory. He'd watched Sophie with a particular quality of attention that was different from the way he watched everything else. Softer, less alert, like whatever tension he carried in his body had a place to set itself down. She'd done a lot of things in her career. She'd hired people, fired people, out-negotiated men twice her age, built a company from a borrowed server room and 3 employees to 4,700. She was not unaccustomed to confident, capable people. There was something about the way Landon Hayes occupied a corner booth in a mediocre coffee shop that made all of that feel like the wrong unit of measurement. She called him that evening and said some of it, the true parts, the ones she could get the words around. And then she went back to her penthouse office and sat at her desk surrounded by glass and city light and the particular kind of silence that comes from being in a large, expensive space entirely alone. And she thought, Sophie said this seems lonely, and she was right. And I told her she was right. She hadn't told anyone they were right about that in a long time. She picked up a different phone, the encrypted one. She called a man named Garrett who did security work that didn't appear on any org chart. She said, I need you to pull everything on the Aspen Ridge event. Guest list, catering staff, bar service, anyone who had access to the Meridian room in the 6 hours before the dinner. I need it yesterday. Garrett, who had worked for her for 2 years and asked very few questions, said he'd have something in 48 hours. She hung up and stared at the city. Marcus Vale, 8 years. He'd been there the night she'd pitched her first real investor, sitting across from her in a pizza place writing numbers on a napkin while she talked because he was better at math under pressure than she was. He'd worked 20-hour days with her for 3 years before the company made its first real profit. He knew her coffee order and her sister's name and the specific reason she hated flying window seats. She couldn't say his name yet, not even to herself. She opened her laptop and started reading acquisition reports. Garrett's report arrived in 41 hours, not 48. It was thorough and it was bad. The guest list at the Meridian Room dinner had included 11 Stellarian board members or major shareholders, 3 of their external counsel, and a delegation of 4 executives from a private equity firm called Hessian Capital, which had been quietly accumulating Stellarian shares for the past 14 months. The report included a financial summary that Ariana already knew because she'd been watching it for a year. Hessian Capital currently held a shade under 22% of Stellarian's outstanding shares, which was the second largest position after Ariana's own 31%. They needed a board majority to force any kind of governance change. They did not currently have a board majority, but they had been talking. Garrett's report included summaries of several communications. The methods of interception were described in terms Ariana did not ask clarifying questions about, between Hessian's lead partner, a man named Carlyle, and two Stellarian board members, a man named Reeves, who had been on the board for 3 years, and who Ariana had always found slightly cold but not alarming, and a woman named Park, who had joined 18 months ago and who Ariana had actually liked. The communications discussed, in language that was careful but not careful enough, the possibility of presenting a governance motion that would restructure the CEO role and require board approval for all major strategic decisions. This was, in practice, a way to neuter the CEO without removing her. It was a way to make the title hers while making the company theirs. The timing they'd been discussing was the upcoming annual shareholder meeting scheduled for April, 3 months away. And then there was the other thing. Garrett had included, near the end of the report, a short section with the heading Catering/Bar Service. Anomalies. The mineral water served at the Meridian Room dinner had been supplied through a contracted vendor. That vendor had a new employee, hired 6 weeks prior, who had no verifiable employment history before the date of hire and whose address resolved to a vacant property. That employee had been assigned, on the night of the dinner, to the section of the room where Ariana was seated. That employee no longer appeared in the vendor's records. Ariana read the section 3 times. She sat back in her chair. She thought, this wasn't a board maneuver. Board maneuvers were paperwork and politics and careful language. This was something else. This was someone who didn't want to wait for April. She thought about Marcus Vale carrying a glass of mineral water across the Meridian Room and placing it beside her hand with a smile and a comment about the speaker who'd just finished presenting, something funny she'd laughed at, and then she'd lifted the glass. She pressed her palms flat against her desk and breathed. She didn't sleep that night. What? She called Landon 4 days after the coffee shop, not because she'd planned to, but because it was 10:30 at night and she was sitting in her car in a parking garage because she didn't want to go upstairs and be in the penthouse, and she needed to hear a voice that wasn't on payroll. She'd been followed. Not in a dramatic way, no squealing tires, no one in a ski mask. A dark sedan had appeared in her mirror on 3 separate occasions over the past 5 days. Different drivers, same vehicle registration that resolved to a shell company when Garrett ran it. It was the kind of surveillance that was meant to be noticed, she thought, a message more than an investigation. We know where you are. Landon picked up on the second ring. She hadn't planned what she was going to say. It turned out she didn't need to. Are you okay? He said, and he sounded awake, which meant she'd woken him up, and she felt briefly terrible about that. How did you eat? It's 10:30 at night, and you don't seem like someone who calls just to talk. A pause. I'm not complaining. I'm asking. She looked at the concrete pillar in front of her car. The fluorescent light of the garage was ugly and flat, and it made everything look slightly wrong. I've been having a strange week. Strange how? She turned it over in her mind. The report. The sedan. Marcus's face. The shape of what she was building toward and couldn't yet say. I think the thing at Aspen Ridge wasn't an accident, she said. A silence on his end. She couldn't read it. I know, he said. She blinked. What? The man on the right side of the room, Landon said. When I came in, he was standing about 6 feet from the group around you. Everyone else was either moving toward you or frozen. Fight or flight, normal panic response. He wasn't doing either. He was watching, just watching. A cold feeling that had nothing to do with the parking garage. You noticed that in that moment? I noticed things, he said simply, without self-congratulation. I didn't know what it meant then. I still don't know what it means, but I've been thinking about it. Can you describe him? He described him. The height, the build, the specific quality of stillness. She thought about it. Thought about the Hessian Capital delegation. Why didn't you... She stopped. You could have said something to security. I had nothing concrete. A man standing in a weird way at a party isn't a police report. A pause. Are you safe right now? Second lied. This time she said, I'm in my car, in a parking garage. I didn't want to go upstairs. Okay. He didn't press for more. I think someone's been following me, she said, and it came out of her before she'd decided to say it. And once it was out, she felt simultaneously exposed and lighter, the way a pressure release worked. Same vehicle, different drivers, he said immediately. She stared at the pillar. How did you... That's how I'd do it if I wanted someone to know they were being watched without being able to prove it. His voice was steady. Not alarmed, not performing calm. Actually calm. The kind that came from somewhere solid. How long? 5 days? Maybe 6? A silence that she was starting to learn was him thinking. You have security staff? Yes, and a security consultant. Does he know about the car? I told Garrett today. Good. A pause. Ariana, don't go to your parking garage alone at night anymore. I know, she said, and she did know, and she'd done it anyway because the penthouse felt like a box, and sometimes the only thing that made sense was to drive until the city felt manageable again. I know. I'm not lecturing, he said. I'm just... He stopped, started again. I've spent 4 years being responsible for someone else's safety. I know what the threat assessment blind spot feels like. When you're scared, you stop thinking about proximity and you start thinking about distance. You wanted to be somewhere that wasn't the penthouse. I get it. Just don't do it alone. She was quiet for a moment. You have a daughter, she said, and a job. You don't have to... I know I don't have to, he said. Something about the way he said it. She looked at her hands on the steering wheel. She thought about the way he'd looked in the coffee shop, watching the door without making it obvious, the way you'd watch a door if you'd learned a long time ago that emergencies didn't announce themselves. Can I ask you something? She said. Yeah. Why do you keep picking up? A long pause. Long enough that she thought maybe she'd misread this entirely, maybe she'd crossed some line she couldn't see. I don't know yet, he said finally, which was honest in a way she hadn't expected. Most people, in her experience, had an answer ready. A shaped answer, a clean answer, an answer that closed the subject. Landon Hayes said he didn't know yet like it was the plainest fact in the world, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Okay, she said. Go upstairs, he said. Text me when you're inside. She almost said she didn't need to. She texted him when she got inside instead. His reply came back in under a minute. Good. Lock the deadbolt. She stood in the middle of the penthouse kitchen, still in her coat, and looked at those 4 words on her phone screen, and something in her chest did something she didn't have a clean word for. She locked the deadbolt. Over the next 2 weeks, things got worse, and she learned to manage the getting worse by breaking it into pieces small enough to work with. Garrett confirmed the shell company link back to a holding entity that had connections, circuitous, deniable, but connections, to Hessian Capital. The Stellarian board votes she'd been counting in her head resolved into something less comfortable than she'd hoped. She had 4 firm votes, including her own. Reeves and Park were clearly in Hessian's corner, and the remaining 5 board members were varying shades of uncertain. You needed 6 of 9 for a majority motion. She was short. Marcus Vail behaved, in every observable way, like nothing had changed. He ran the Tuesday operations meeting with his usual efficiency. He flagged a supply chain issue in the Singapore data center and resolved it by Thursday. He brought her coffee the way he always did on mornings when they had back-to-back calls. Without being asked, the particular order she'd told him once 4 years ago and never had to repeat. She watched him with a new quality of attention and hated herself for it. She had not told Garrett about Marcus. Not yet. The evidence was circumstantial. He'd been near her drink. The timing worked. But so did 10 other explanations. And accusing her COO of 8 years of attempted poisoning without evidence that could survive scrutiny was a way to detonate her company from the inside and give Hessian exactly the governance crisis they needed. She kept it inside and it sat in her chest like something with weight. She talked to Landon. Not every night, not in a way that felt like a pattern she'd chosen, more like it had assembled itself, the way routine sometimes did, quietly and without a formal decision. 3 4 times a week, sometimes late, sometimes just for 20 minutes while he was on a lunch break and she was in a car between meetings. And he'd tell her something Sophie had said or done, and she'd feel the pressure in her chest ease back a few degrees. Sophie had apparently decided to build an elaborate snow-based diorama for a school project about ecosystems, which had required Landon to drive to 4 different stores for specific types of craft foam that were apparently critical to the structural integrity of the Arctic tundra biome section. And he told this story in a flat, resigned tone that was somehow more affectionate than any effusive telling could have been. "Did she get the foam?" Ariana asked. "Third store. They only had 2 sheets left. She negotiated with the cashier for a discount because one had a corner bent. Did it work?" "She got 30 cents off." A pause. "I'm not sure if I should be proud or concerned." "Both," Ariana said. "Definitely both." She was in the back of a car on the way to a meeting with Stellarian's outside legal counsel when she said this, and the attorney seated across from her looked up from his notes with a mildly confused expression. And Ariana made herself stop smiling and said, "Sorry, continue." She thought about Sophie's negotiation for a long time afterward. She thought about what it would mean to grow up with a father who showed up like that, who drove to 4 stores for craft foam, who noticed things, who said he didn't know yet and meant it. She thought about what her own childhood would have looked like with that specific quality of attention in it, and she set the thought aside because it didn't go anywhere useful. The day she confirmed her worst suspicion about Marcus, it started with something small. She was going through access logs, routine, something she did herself rather than delegating because there were things she trusted only her own eyes to see. And she found a ghost entry in Stellarian's internal communications archive. Someone had accessed a folder of pre-board meeting strategy documents 6 weeks ago, using credentials that were registered to a consultant who'd left the company 14 months prior. The consultant's credentials should have been revoked. They hadn't been. Failure to revoke was the kind of mistake that happened in large organizations. It could be an IT oversight. She pulled the credential revocation logs and found that the consultant's access had been manually extended, not accidentally left active, but deliberately extended, by a user with administrative privileges. There was only a small number of people with that level of administrative access to the Stellarian credential system. Marcus Vale was one of them. She sat in her office for 4 hours after that, staring at the access logs, and she went back through the last 8 years in her memory with the exhausting methodical honesty that the moment demanded. She found things she should have seen, small pattern breaks she'd attributed to stress, to growth pains, to the ordinary friction of a fast-scaling company. She found the moment, she thought, maybe 30 months ago, around the time Hessian Capital's position in Stellarian had first begun to grow, when something in Marcus had shifted, when he'd started pushing for governance changes she'd rejected, when his frustration had acquired an edge she'd told herself was reasonable. 8 years. She pressed her hands flat on the desk and she breathed. Then she called Landon. He picked up in the middle of what sounded like a working afternoon. Background noise, metal, the specific acoustic character of a large industrial space. "I can call later," she said. "Hold on." The background noise shifted and then reduced, a door closing. "What happened?" She told him. Not everything, not the operational details. She was careful about operational details, but the shape of it, the access logs, the credentials, what it told her, what she thought it meant. He listened. He didn't fill the silence with sound when she stopped. He waited until she was done. "Okay," he said. "Have you told anyone else?" "No." "Not even Garrett?" "Not yet." "Ariana." He said her name in the particular way he had when he was choosing his words carefully. Not softly, not firmly, just direct. "You need to tell Garrett, today. You can't carry this alone." "I know." "Do you?" "Because I'm hearing someone who's been carrying it for a while already." She looked at the window. The city was doing its January thing, gray and wet and indifferent. "If I tell Garrett, it becomes real." "It's already real," he said quietly. "You know it's already real." She did. She'd known it in the Meridian room before she'd lost consciousness, And she'd known it in the hospital room, and she'd been walking around knowing it for weeks now, and doing the thing she did when she couldn't afford to feel something, which was to defer the feeling until the action was handled. "I'm scared," she said, and it came out of her without the usual editorial process, and she heard it hang in the air between them and felt suddenly, enormously exposed. A silence. Then, "I know." 2 words. And something in the way he said them, not fixing, not reassuring in the performative way, just acknowledging, just receiving it without flinching, did something to the tightness in her chest that all the strategy and all the contingency planning hadn't been able to do. "I'll call Garrett," she said. "Good. And Landon—" She stopped. "Yeah?" She thought about what she wanted to say. She thought about the parking garage and the deadbolt and the 4 stores for craft foam and the way he'd said, "I don't know yet," in a voice that had no pretense in it at all. "Thank you," she said, "for picking up." A pause. When he spoke again, his voice was different, still steady, but with something underneath it she couldn't fully name. "Go call Garrett," he said. "I'll talk to you later." She called Garrett. Garrett did not react with shock, because Garrett did not react to things with shock. He said he'd had his own suspicions for 3 weeks and had been building the case. He said he could have a preliminary presentation ready in 72 hours. She said, "Make it 48." She hung up and sat in her office as the light changed and the city outside her window shifted from afternoon gray to evening dark. And she thought about the path she was on and what it was going to cost. And she thought about a corner booth in a coffee shop and a man who watched the door and a little girl who told a stranger she seemed sad, without knowing she was handing her the truest thing anyone had said to her in years. The cars below moved through the dark. The city kept going, indifferent and enormous. Ariana opened her laptop and started reading board bylaws. Garrett's 48 hours turned into 53, and when the presentation arrived, it was 61 slides and a separate appendix that Ariana read twice through in a single sitting with a glass of water she forgot to drink going warm beside her laptop. The picture it assembled was not the picture she'd been building in her head. It was worse. Marcus Vail had been in contact with Hessian Capital's lead partner, a man named Philip Carlyle, for 22 months. Not 14, the way Hessian's share accumulation suggested. 22. Which meant the relationship had started 8 months before Hessian had made its first significant share purchase, which meant the share accumulation wasn't opportunism, it was coordinated. Marcus had gone to them. He had laid out the architecture of his own company and told them where the load-bearing walls were. The access log anomaly Ariana had found was one of 9. Garrett had mapped them all. Internal strategy documents, board member communications, a financial model that projected Stellarion's valuation under 3 different governance scenarios, one of which was labeled, in language that was almost admirably direct, post-Sterling restructure. Post-Sterling. She said it out loud in her empty office, just to hear what it sounded like. It sounded like the end of everything she'd built. She called Garrett back and said, "Can we prove the poisoning?" A pause. Not conclusively. The catering employee is gone. The vendor's records have been cleaned. We can prove the credential anomaly, the Hessian communications, the breach of fiduciary duty, the Aspen Ridge event. Another pause. Circumstantially, yes. Legally, it's thin. Thin enough to get him arrested? Thin enough for a civil action. Criminal would be harder. She thought about that. What about Carlyle? What do we have on Hessian directly? The communications are the primary asset. The question is admissibility and chain of custody. Garrett's voice had the quality it always had when he was being careful. Measured, precise, pacing out each word. If this goes to a board presentation, the communications are usable. If it goes to litigation, we need outside counsel involved before we do anything else. Outside counsel is already in it, she said, thinking of the attorney in the back of the car who'd looked confused when she laughed about the craft foam. Good. I'd also recommend... He stopped. What? Do you have anyone outside the company structure you trust? Someone with no exposure to the internal politics? I'm not talking legally. I'm talking about an asset problem. The board meeting is the arena we're aiming for. Between now and then, if Carlyle and Vail figure out we're building a case, they're going to move. Possibly move hard. She sat with that. How hard? She said. Hard enough that I'd like there to be another set of eyes on the situation that I can coordinate with. Someone they won't see coming, because they won't know to look for him. She already knew the answer to this before she'd finished processing the question. She'd known it the way you know a fact before you can explain where you learned it. She called Landon at 8:17 that evening, and she did not start with small talk. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to hear the whole thing before you answer." A beat. "Okay." She told him about Garrett's report. She told him about the 22 months and the 9 access anomalies in the document titled Post-Sterling Restructure. She told him about Carlyle and Hessian and the board arithmetic. She told him about the shell company and the sedan and the ghost catering employee. And then she told him about Marcus Vail. When she finished, the silence on his end lasted long enough that she started to wonder if the call had dropped. "Landon." "I'm here," he said. "I'm thinking." She waited. "The man in the Meridian room," he said. "The one who was watching. Can you get me a photo of this Carlyle?" She hadn't expected that. "Yes." "Send it to me tonight." She sent it inside of 10 minutes. The silence stretched while he looked at it. "That's him," Landon said, the cold feeling again running from her sternum outward. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She pressed her palm flat on the desk and focused on breathing at a normal rate. "Okay. You said you needed to ask me something." "I need help," she said. "Not legal help, not financial. Garrett says we need someone they won't see coming, someone outside the structure, someone who—" She stopped, reordered. "I'm not asking you to do anything dangerous. I'm asking if you'd be willing to work with Garrett to help us document what's happening between now and the board meeting. Surveillance support, a second set of eyes. You're good at noticing things." A long pause. "Ariana, I know what I'm asking." "I don't think you do," he said. "I have an 8-year-old. "I know." "This isn't—" He stopped. She could hear him move, the particular sound of someone standing up, changing rooms. A door. The acoustic shift to somewhere quieter. This isn't an action movie. If these people poisoned you and they're willing to hire surveillance operations, they're not going to play nice when they feel cornered. "I know that." "And you're still asking?" "Yes." Another silence, then, "Tell me exactly what Garrett needs." Or, she met them both in person for the first time as a unit, Ariana, Garrett, and Landon, in a conference room in a building that Garrett used for exactly these kinds of conversations. The kind that couldn't happen inside Stellarian's offices for obvious reasons. It was nondescript, on the 14th floor of a mid-level commercial block in the financial district, and it smelled faintly of old coffee and dry erase markers. Landon was already there when Ariana arrived. He was standing at the window looking at the street below, hands in the pockets of a jacket that was not the navy blazer, and he turned when she came in, and something passed between them that wasn't quite a greeting and wasn't quite anything else. A quick taking of inventory, mutual, the way two people looked at each other when they'd only ever spoken in the dark and were now in the same light. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. Garrett arrived 6 minutes later and moved the room immediately into operational mode, which Ariana suspected was intentional on his part. Garrett had a gift for reading rooms and adjusting accordingly, and the room had contained something he'd chosen to redirect. The situation laid out in Garrett's flat, precise terms. The board meeting was 11 weeks away. Hessian Capital and their internal allies, Vail, Reeves, Park, needed a board majority to pass the governance restructure. They were currently 2 votes short. Their play would be to either pressure or persuade 2 of the 5 uncommitted board members before April. Ariana's play was to build a documented case of conspiracy, breach of fiduciary duty, and potential criminal conduct sufficient to remove Reeves and Park from the board entirely before the vote was called, which would either reduce the threshold needed for majority or disqualify the motion. "The documentation we have is good," Garrett said. "It's not complete. We need 3 more things." He listed them. A direct record of communication between Carlyle and at least 1 board member within the past 60 days, confirming the current conspiracy rather than historical planning. A chain of custody documentation of the credential breach that could be presented at board level without exposing how it was obtained, and something concrete that tied the Aspen Ridge event to the Hessian network, even circumstantially, because without it, the story was corporate conspiracy, and with it, the story was attempted murder. And those were different levels of urgency. Landon said nothing through most of this. He listened with his whole body, with a quality of presence that didn't require movement or commentary. When Garrett finished, he said, "The sedan. Do you still have the registration?" "Yes," Garrett said. "And you've confirmed the shell company connection to Hessian?" One layer removed. Parent LLC to a subsidiary that Hessian manages. Landon looked at him. If they're running surveillance on Ariana, there's a contractor, someone local who's doing the actual physical work, someone who talked to someone who has a phone. That contractor is your chain of custody problem. If you can find him, and he can testify to who hired the job, it connects Hessian to the operation directly. Garrett was quiet for a moment, the particular quality of quiet that meant he was recalibrating. "You've done this before," Garrett said. "No," Landon said, "but I've thought about it." Ariana looked at him across the table. He was looking at Garrett, and his face had the focused clarity it got when a problem had shape, and he was working the shape. She had noticed, over weeks of phone calls, that he moved differently when he was working a problem. The watchfulness became something more active. "The contractor is findable," Garrett said. "It'll take time." "How much time?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. Landon nodded. "What do you need me for in the interim?" Garrett laid it out, point-to-point surveillance documentation on 3 specific individuals who were meeting with Hessian representatives over the next 2 weeks. Board members, external counsel. The meetings were happening, Garrett's sources had confirmed that much, but documenting them required physical presence that Garrett's team couldn't provide without risk of exposure. Faces, times, locations. Clean and deniable. Landon said, "I can do that." Ariana said, "Landon, I said I can do it," he said, not dismissively, but with the tone of someone who had already processed the objection and arrived at a conclusion. She looked at him. He looked back. "It's documentation work," he said. "I'm not confronting anyone. I'm not putting myself in a position where they'd know who I am. I'm watching, and I'm recording what I see." A pause. "I do this kind of work, Ariana. I pay attention to what's around me. I have always paid attention to what's around me. This isn't a departure from who I am. It's just aimed at something." She wanted to argue with that and couldn't find the footing. They spent another 90 minutes working through specifics. When they were done, Garrett left first with the efficiency of someone with a long list of things to do and very little interest in lingering. Ariana and Landon were left in the conference room with the bad fluorescent light and the smell of old coffee. "You didn't have to say yes," she said. "I know." "You have Sophie." "Yeah." He looked at her. "I also have the ability to walk away from a situation that gets bad. I'm not an employee. I'm not in your organizational chart. If this gets dangerous, I pull out." A pause. "But it's not dangerous yet. Right now, it's just documentation." She studied his face. "You say that very calmly for someone who's describing surveillance work on a corporate conspiracy." "I say most things calmly." "You do," she said, and it came out more direct than she'd intended, and something shifted in the quality of the air between them, and neither of them moved for a moment. "Go home," he said. "Lock the deadbolt." "You're not going to let that go." "No," he said, and he said it without a smile, but with something around his eyes that was adjacent to one. "I'm not." Well, the next 11 days were the most carefully ordinary days of Landon's adult life. He went to work. He picked Sophie up from school. He helped with homework, long division, which Sophie found personally offensive, and a reading response about a book involving a dog who solved neighborhood crimes, which she found deeply satisfying. He made dinner, bad dinner on Tuesday, because he'd forgotten to defrost the chicken and had to improvise with what was in the pantry, which Sophie ate without complaint, but with a diplomatic expression that told him everything. He watched movies on Friday night, the same battered couch, the same side-by-side arrangement that had been their Friday ritual for 4 years, Sophie eventually falling asleep before the credits with her head against his arm. He documented Marcus Vail meeting a man he confirmed, via photograph cross-reference with Garrett's file, was one of Hessian Capital's senior associates, at a restaurant in the east end of the city on a Tuesday at 1:15 in the afternoon. He documented a Stellarian board member named Reeves entering and leaving a law firm that had no visible connection to anything Stellarian related, in a meeting that lasted 44 minutes and was not on any calendar Garrett had access to. He did these things quietly, from distances that made him irrelevant, with a phone camera and the particular kind of patience he'd developed over 4 years of being the person who had to hold things together without visible seams. He talked to Ariana. He had stopped trying to account for when and why. It had organized itself into something neither of them named, which suited him because naming things made them available for examination, and he was not prepared for the examination. He knew what he felt. He'd known for a while, in the way you knew things that you weren't ready to say out loud. He kept it in the part of himself where he kept things that needed more time before they were real. What he let himself say, instead, was, she was different than he'd expected her to be. She was sharp in a way that was sometimes impatient, that occasionally showed its edges when she was tired or when something surprised her. She had very high expectations of herself and a corresponding difficulty extending herself the grace she'd have extended to anyone else without hesitation. She told a story with perfect comic timing and then looked surprised when it landed, like she wasn't used to being funny in front of people. She asked questions that were incisive and direct, and then listened to the answers with total focus. She talked to Sophie on the phone twice, both times because Sophie had asked to, which had required Landon to hand over his phone with a feeling he couldn't fully categorize. Sophie, characteristically, had conducted both conversations without any apparent awareness that she was talking to one of the most influential people in American business. She told Ariana about the ecosystem diorama, which she had finished and gotten a grade of A- on. The minus being, in Sophie's assessment, a political decision by Mrs. Hallstrom. She asked Ariana whether the computers at Stellarian could talk to each other, and when Ariana explained server networks in child-accessible terms, Sophie said, so it's like a school but for information. And Ariana had said, that is actually a better explanation than the one I give investors, and Sophie accepted this with complete equanimity. After the second call, when Sophie had handed the phone back and gone to finish her dinner, Ariana said, she's incredible. She's complicated, Landon said. She's 8, and she's already better at most things than I am. That's exactly what I mean. He was quiet for a moment. She likes you. I like her. A pause. She doesn't connect with people easily. She's friendly, she's fine in groups, but she doesn't actually decide to like someone very quickly. He said it carefully, as a fact, not as a strategy or a move. So, I just wanted you to know that. The silence on Ariana's end had the texture of something being absorbed. Thank you, she said quietly, for telling me that. The call from Garrett came on a Wednesday morning while Landon was on a job site, and the tone of it, controlled, stripped of the usual methodical pacing, told him immediately that something had changed. They know about you, Garrett said. He stepped away from his crew. What do you mean, they know? The surveillance contractor. He was deeper in than I thought. He'd been running facial recognition on the vehicles and individuals in Ariana's proximity over the past 3 weeks. Your face appears on 2 of the surveillance logs from the documentation work. They ran the face, and they have your name. The job site noise went distant. He stood still. How long? He said. The facial match was flagged 48 hours ago. I found out this morning. I don't know exactly what they've done with it yet, but Sophie. He was already moving. Has anyone... I don't have any indication that they've moved on your address yet. But Landon, this is now a different situation than it was 72 hours ago. He was already calculating. School schedule. Sophie was in school until 3:15. It was 11:40. He had 3 hours and 35 minutes. I need to know everything they have on me, he said, and I need to know in the next hour. Working on it. He called Ariana. She picked up in one ring. He told her. He did it fast and clean, without decoration, because there wasn't time and because the only useful things to say were the ones that led to action. Her voice on the other end went very still in a way that was different from her normal stillness. I'm sorry, she said. Landon, Don't, he said. Not right now. Right now I need you to tell me. Do you have someone you trust at the highest level of your security operation? Someone who can move fast and quietly on a residential address? Yes, Garrett can, other than Garrett. Garrett's managing four things right now. Someone else. Diana's brother, she said without hesitating. Ex-military. He works privately and he's available immediately. I'd trust him completely. Call him, give him my address and Sophie's school. I need eyes on both locations in the next 40 minutes. Already dialing, she said. He hung up and walked back toward his truck, moving in a way that his crew from a distance would read as purposeful rather than urgent. He did not want to alarm anyone. He did not want anyone to ask questions. He said to his site lead, "Family thing. I'm out for the day," and he was in his truck and driving before anyone could respond. He drove to Sophie's school. He parked across the street from the main entrance in a position where he could see both doors and the corner of the block. He sat in the truck and he breathed in the specific way he'd taught himself to breathe when he needed his hands steady. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. He'd learned it from a YouTube video 3 years ago during a period when the apartment at night was very dark and very quiet, and he'd needed something concrete to hold on to. He watched the school entrance and he waited. His phone buzzed. "Ariana. Nolan's on your building. Clean. No one's been there. I'll send his number." Another buzz. A moment later. "He'll do Sophie's school pickup if you need him to. His call sign is..." A string of text. A photo. A man in his 40s, solid, steady-eyed. The kind of face that communicated competence without requiring it to be stated. Landon texted back, "I'm already at the school. Tell him to stay on the building." He sat in the truck for 2 hours and 40 minutes, watching a school entrance in the middle of an ordinary Wednesday, and he thought about the precise coordinates of everything he stood to lose. And he felt the fear in a clear, honest way, and he let himself feel it because denying it would be stupid, and he had never been able to afford stupid. At 3:15, Sophie came out of the double doors in the middle of a group of kids, her backpack on both shoulders the way she wore it, despite his ongoing efforts to get her to use the chest strap. She was talking to a girl with red braids who she'd mentioned exactly once, and Landon had filed the name. She was laughing at something. He got out of the truck. She saw him, and her face did the thing it did. A small, involuntary brightening, the kind that preceded the practiced cool of actually, "I'm 8 and very mature." "Dad, you never pick me up on Wednesdays." "Felt like it," he said. She looked at him, the gray-green eyes. "The assessment. Is something wrong?" "No," he said with total conviction, because she was 8 and there were things she didn't need to carry. "Come on, I'll get you a hot chocolate." She fell into step beside him and slipped her hand into his automatically, the way she'd done since she was small enough to be carried. He held it and looked at the street in both directions and walked her to the truck. He called Ariana at 9 that night after Sophie was in bed and the apartment was quiet. He'd spent the evening doing exactly what he always did. Dinner, homework, the couch, the movie. And he'd been almost completely present for all of it, which was something he was capable of when he needed to be. The fear had moved from the front of his mind to the back, where it sat and waited. "Garrett found the asset," Ariana said before he could speak. "The contractor. He's been brought in." A pause. "Brought in as in..." Garrett talked to him. "The man is not a true believer. He was working for money. He's prepared to testify to the chain of engagement. He has records." "What kind of records?" "Electronic communications, hiring instructions, fee schedules." Another pause, different texture. "And photographs from the surveillance logs. You're in 3 of them, Landon. Clear face shots." He was quiet. "I'm sorry," she said. "I keep saying that, and I know it doesn't..." "Ariana." He said her name the same way she said his when she needed him to receive something. "Stop apologizing for other people's choices. You didn't put those cameras on me." A breath on her end. "They know who you are. They know about Sophie." "I know." "Does that change anything?" He thought about it honestly. He thought about Sophie laughing on the way out of school, the red-braided friend, the hot chocolate he'd bought them both. He thought about the apartment with its bad carpet and the water heater that cleared its throat and the particular quality of safety that the 4 walls held. He thought about what it would mean to walk away from this now. Ariana left with a half-built case 3 weeks from the finish line, with people who'd already poisoned her once and would not hesitate to move on her again. He thought about what Claire would have said. He didn't often let himself think about what Claire would have said, because it went places that cost something he didn't always have to spend. But he thought about it now. Claire had been, among other things, the most morally uncomplicated person he'd ever known. She didn't labor over what was right. She just did it, and then looked at him with those gray-green eyes. Sophie had her eyes, absolutely had her eyes, and said, "What took you so long? What took you so long?" "No," he said. "It doesn't change anything, but I need Sophie out of the apartment." "I have a place," Ariana said immediately. "Secure, I've used it before, completely off any record I've ever created. My personal name isn't on anything connected to the property. I bought it through a trust 7 years ago, and I've never discussed it publicly. Not even Diana knows about it." "You have a secret safe house," he said. "I have a cabin in the Blue Ridge that I bought when I was 23 because I thought I'd need a place to think, and then never actually went because I never had time to think." A beat. "It has heat and running water and a very good deadbolt." He almost said "you and deadbolts" and stopped himself because this wasn't that moment. "Who would take her?" he said. "Nolan. Diana's brother. You've seen his photo. He's good with kids and he has 3 of his own." A pause. "Landon, I know how much I'm asking." He looked across the apartment toward Sophie's closed bedroom door. There was a strip of light under it. She was reading past her bedtime, the way she always did, the small, quiet rebellion of someone who'd decided the rules on this particular point were negotiable. "I know you know," he said. He sat for a moment in the kitchen's half-dark. "Tell me about the board meeting," he said. "Tell me where we are." She told him. The contractor's testimony, combined with the credential documentation and the Hessian communications, was sufficient, in outside counsel's assessment, to bring a motion at the board level for emergency removal of Reeves and Park on grounds of conflict of interest and conspiracy. That motion needed 4 votes to proceed. She had 4. If the motion succeeded, the governance restructure vote couldn't reach majority without its 2 primary architects. "The problem," Ariana said, "is that Carlisle knows the timeline as well as we do. If he figures out we have the contractor, he moves before April. He calls an emergency board session, pushes the vote before we can disqualify anyone." "Can he do that?" "Technically, yes. Any 2 board members can call an emergency session with 48 hours notice. He has at least 2. So we have to get to the board before he does." "Yes." A beat. "I've asked outside counsel to prepare the disqualification motion for filing within 72 hours. I need 1 more piece of documentation. The board member communications within the past 60 days. You and Garrett identified a meeting last week between Reeves and the Hessian associate. I documented it." "The footage is time-stamped?" "Yes. And I got the building entry log from Garrett's source. Reeves signed in under his own name." A pause. "He didn't think anyone was watching." "They never do," she said quietly. He heard something in her voice then. Not sadness exactly, but the particular weight of someone who has looked directly at a betrayal and processed it, and is now on the other side of the processing, in the flat, steady country beyond it. "Are you all right?" he said. "No," she said without hesitation. "But I'm functional." "That counts." "Does it?" "Some days it's all there is," he said, and he said it from a specific place, the place where he kept the years of mornings when functional was the whole ceiling. "And you build from there." The silence on her end was the kind that felt inhabited. Warm, almost. "Landon," her voice was careful. "After this is over." "Yeah," he said, before she could finish. A beat. "You don't know what I was going to say." "No," he admitted. "But whatever it is, yeah." He heard something that was almost a laugh. Not performed, not PR ready, real. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Get Sophie packed." He looked at the strip of light under his daughter's door. "I'll tell her it's an adventure." Is she going to believe that? He thought about the gray-green assessment eyes. "No," he said, "but she'll play along because she's polite." "She gets that from you." "She gets nothing from me," he said. "She arrived like this." I just try to keep up. He sat in the kitchen for a few more minutes after they hung up, and then he got up and knocked on Sophie's door and went in and sat on the edge of her bed, and she put her book down with the careful, unhurried patience of someone who had been expecting this conversation and was prepared to hear it out. He told her as much of the truth as an 8-year-old needed, which was, he was helping someone, and there were some complicated people involved, and he needed her somewhere safe for a little while. And there was a cabin in the mountains with heat and running water, and Nolan, he showed her the photo, was going to take her, and it was maybe a week. Sophie looked at the photo, looked at him, the assessment. "Is Ariana in trouble?" she said. He was quiet for a beat. "Yes." "And you're helping her?" "Yes." Sophie picked up her book again, turned it over in her hands, and then set it deliberately on her nightstand in the way she had when she was closing one thing and opening another. "Okay," she said. "Does the cabin have Wi-Fi?" "I'll ask." "Ask tonight," she said. "I have a book report due." He kissed her forehead. She accepted it with the dignity of someone receiving a reasonable gesture. He turned off the light on his way out. He texted Ariana. "Does the cabin have Wi-Fi?" Her reply came back in 2 minutes. "Installing it tomorrow morning. Tell Sophie the password will be her name." He stood in the hallway of the apartment, and the building settled around him in the cold, and he looked at his phone and thought about the strip of light that had been under Sophie's door, and the cabin in the Blue Ridge, and the board meeting 11 weeks away that was now maybe 48 hours away, and the exact shape of what was coming. He went to bed and slept 4 hours and woke up at 5 in the dark and made coffee and started getting ready. There was work to do. Nolan left with Sophie at 6:40 in the morning. Landon stood at the window and watched the car pull out of the parking lot below and held the particular feeling of that, his daughter in a vehicle heading away from him, toward a mountain cabin she'd never seen, driven by a man she'd met 40 minutes ago. And he let himself feel the full weight of it rather than pushing it down, because pushing it down would have made him stupid, and he couldn't afford stupid right now. Sophie had been characteristically Sophie about the whole thing. She'd packed her bag with focused efficiency. She'd asked Nolan 3 direct questions before getting in the car. "Do you have kids? Do you know first aid? And what's your favorite book?" And she'd accepted his answers. 3, "Yes, and I've used it," and "Lonesome Dove" by Larry McMurtry, with the same evaluative gravity she brought to most things. She'd hugged Landon at the door. Not the quick goodbye hug, but the real one, both arms, face pressed against his chest. And then she'd pulled back and looked up at him with Claire's eyes and said, "Be careful," with a directness that hit him somewhere low. He'd said he would. He stood at the window until the car was gone, and then he turned back to the apartment, which was very quiet. He had 4 hours before the first thing on Garrett's timeline. He used one of them to clean the apartment, not because it needed cleaning, but because doing something concrete with his hands was the only thing that worked when the quiet got too large. He washed dishes. He folded the blanket on the couch. He threw out a takeout container he'd been meaning to throw out for 3 days. He thought about the board meeting. The 48-hour emergency session window was Carlisle's weapon, and the clock on it was already running, whether Carlisle had pulled the trigger yet or not. Garrett's read was that Carlisle didn't yet know about the contractor. The man had been brought in quietly, no visible disruption to his previous activities, but that window was closing. Once Carlisle moved to call the emergency session, the timeline compressed to 2 days. 2 days to file the disqualification motion, get it in front of the board chair, and force a procedural review before the governance vote could be called. Ariana's outside counsel had been working for 36 hours straight. The motion was drafted. The evidence package was assembled. What remained was the board chair. The board chair was a woman named Eleanor Voss, 71 years old, who had been on Stellarian's board since the company's Series B round, and who had never, in Ariana's experience, made a decision she hadn't first examined from every available angle. She was not aligned with Hessian. She was not aligned with Ariana. She was aligned, as far as anyone could tell, with Stellarion itself, with the institution's survival. And she would make whatever decision she believed served that survival, regardless of who it cost. That was either their best asset or their biggest obstacle. It depended entirely on how the evidence landed when Eleanor Voss read it. Ariana was meeting with Eleanor that afternoon. She'd arranged it through channels that bypassed the board's formal calendar. A direct call, a request that couldn't be formally ignored because Ariana was still, for the moment, the CEO. Eleanor had agreed to a private meeting at her home office. That was the tell, Ariana had said. A formal meeting would have been at the company's legal office or boardroom. A home office meant Eleanor was already managing her own version of this situation quietly. Landon's role for the morning was surveillance. One last documentation run. Garrett had a source inside Hessian's building who'd flagged an 11 o'clock meeting between Carlisle and a communications consultant, which was the kind of meeting you scheduled when you were preparing a public narrative, which was the kind of meeting you scheduled when you were about to move. He left the apartment at 8:30. The Hessian capital offices occupied the upper 4 floors of a tower in the business district that had been designed by someone with a strong philosophical commitment to glass. Landon sat in a coffee shop across the street with a clear sightline to the building's main entrance and a cup of coffee he was drinking slowly. He texted Garrett at 9:15. In position. Garrett replied, meeting moved to 10:30. Carlisle arrived early. He's already inside. He drank his coffee and watched the entrance and thought about Ariana sitting in Eleanor Voss's home office, laying out 8 months of documented conspiracy in front of a woman who would decide the outcome based on the quality of the logic. And he thought, she's good at that. Whatever else she was extraordinarily good at walking into a room where the odds were not clearly in her favor and making the math work anyway. He'd watched her do it on phone calls. The way she built an argument, not from the emotional center outward, the way he would have, but from the structural foundation up, stacking premises until the conclusion felt inevitable. It was different from how he thought. He thought from the gut and then checked the logic. She thought from the logic and then, when she trusted you enough, let you see the gut underneath it. He'd been thinking lately about what it meant that she let him see the gut. He filed that thought with the other ones and watched the building. At 10:47, Philip Carlisle came through the lobby doors with 2 men beside him he hadn't come in with. Both were looking at phones. Carlisle was not looking at his phone. Carlisle was looking at the street with the particular quality of attention of someone who had just made a decision and was now measuring the space between himself and the consequences. Landon photographed them. Timestamp, location, faces. His phone buzzed. Garrett. Carlisle just filed the emergency session notice. 48-hour clock started 11 minutes ago. He was already walking back to his truck. He called Ariana as he drove. She picked up on the first ring. I know, she said. Garrett told me. I'm still at Eleanor's. How's it going? A brief silence that told him it was complicated. Eleanor she's thorough. She's been asking questions for 2 hours. That's not bad, it just means I need more time. You have 46 hours. I know the number, Landon. I know you know. He stopped. Sorry. I know. A pause, and her voice shifted into something less clipped. The documentation is landing well, the credential breach especially. Eleanor used to be a tech executive. She understands what that level of access means. The Hessian communications are the harder sell because of the chain of custody questions. A breath. The contractor's testimony is the linchpin. If Eleanor is persuaded by that, we're fine. If she isn't, she will be, he said. You don't know that. No, he said, but I know what a person looks like when they're looking for a reason to do the right thing. You said Eleanor's aligned with the institution. The institution survives if she acts. The math isn't complicated. She's 2 hours into a meeting she could have ended at any point. She's still there because she wants to be persuaded. A long pause. How are you so calm right now? Ariana said. I'm not calm, he said. I'm driving in city traffic at 11:15 in the morning, and I sent my daughter to a mountain cabin this morning, and I watched Carlisle walk out of his building looking like a man who'd just dropped a bomb timer. I'm not calm. I'm just occupied. That's the same thing for you, isn't it? Occupied and calm. He thought about it. Maybe. I'll call you when I'm done with Eleanor, she said. I'll be here. He drove back to the apartment and sat at the kitchen table with Garrett's full evidence package open on his laptop and read through it again with the methodical attention he used for job site safety reviews. The same cognitive gear, the same willingness to find the problem rather than avoid it. He found 2 things that needed clarifying in the documentation timeline and flagged them for outside counsel. He ate a sandwich standing up at the counter. He checked in with Nolan, who reported that Sophie had arrived safely, had immediately assessed the cabin's structural adequacy, found it acceptable, and was at the kitchen table doing her book report on the laptop she'd packed without being asked. He texted Sophie directly. "How's the cabin?" She replied 4 minutes later. "The Wi-Fi is fast. There is a bird outside my window that is very loud. Nolan made eggs. They were okay." He sat with his phone in his hand, and the relief moved through him like a slow exhale that started somewhere deep. "Good," he typed back. "I'll call tonight." "Okay. Be careful, Dad." Second time she'd said that. He didn't examine why it felt like a weight he was grateful to carry. Ariana called at 2:17. He was still at the kitchen table. He knew from the first syllable. "She's filing the procedural review," Ariana said. "It'll be in front of the board by 5 o'clock. The emergency session notice has stayed pending review. Carlisle can't call the meeting until Eleanor rules." He let out a breath. "Okay." "She's not..." Ariana's voice had a quality he hadn't heard before, something pressed thin by the effort of containment. "She's not ruling on the merits yet. She's ruling on process, which means the disqualification motion is in play, but it's not decided." "When does she decide?" "She asked for 18 hours to review the full documentation package with her personal counsel, which means tomorrow morning. That's still inside the 48-hour window." "Barely." A pause. "Carlisle is going to figure out the session is stayed. He's going to know we moved." "Does he know about the contractor?" "Not yet. Garrett says his communication traffic has been normal. No emergency contacts, no unusual outreach. But that clock is also running." He thought about the room, the pieces on the board, the angles. "If Carlisle knows the session is stayed, he knows the disqualification motion is the threat," he said. "He can't do anything about Eleanor's review. She's the chair. That's her domain. What he can do is try to neutralize the evidence before she rules." "The contractor," Ariana said. "Where is he?" "Secured. Garrett has him in a location that..." "Yes, he's secured." "The documentation package?" "Outside counsel's servers, not connected to Stellarian's network." "Garrett's source inside Hessian?" A pause. "That's the exposure point," she said quietly. He thought about it. "Does Carlisle know who the source is?" "Garrett doesn't think so. But if Carlisle starts running internal exposure analysis, which he will, because that's what you do when you know someone has your communications, he's going to look at everyone who had access. Can the source get out?" "Garrett's already on that." He nodded to himself. "Then the window is the same as it was this morning. Eleanor rules by tomorrow morning. Between now and then, nothing changes hands, no one moves, nobody does anything that tells Carlisle more than he already knows. That's the plan. Is it a good plan?" A beat. "It's the only plan." He looked at the kitchen wall. The apartment was very quiet without Sophie in it, a different kind of quiet than he was used to. Not the late-night quiet he'd learned to live with, but a daytime quiet that felt wrong in a cellular way. "I want to see you," he said. A silence. Then, "What?" "Not..." He stopped. Started again. "I want to be in the same room. I'm sitting in my apartment running scenarios, and you're running scenarios somewhere else, and we're going to do that until tomorrow morning, and I'd rather..." He stopped again. He wasn't doing this well. "I'm not good at waiting from a distance." A pause that had a different quality than the tactical ones. "Come here," she said. "I'm at the penthouse." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He was in his truck and driving 8 minutes later. The penthouse was on the 43rd floor of a building in the financial district that Landon would not, under ordinary circumstances, have any business entering. The lobby alone was the size of the apartment building he lived in. He told the desk his name, which Ariana had apparently already called ahead, and the elevator opened on a private code and took him directly up. She opened the door before he knocked. She was in dark slacks and a plain sweater, no blazer, no business armor, and she looked tired in a way she didn't bother hiding. Her hair was loose. She was holding a mug of something, and she looked at him for a moment in the doorway with an expression he couldn't fully decode. "Hi," she said. "Hi." She stepped back to let him in. The penthouse was large and impeccably arranged and had the quality of a space that had been decorated by someone with excellent taste on behalf of a person who was almost never in it. Big windows, city light, a couch that faced the view. A kitchen with a coffee maker that looked like it had been designed by engineers who took the problem very seriously. There were papers spread across the kitchen island. The evidence package, annotated in her handwriting. "You've been over it again," he said. 3 times. She set her mug down. "I keep finding things I want to strengthen. Counsel says it's ready. Counsel says it's sufficient." She looked up. "There's a difference." He looked at her. "Is there a specific thing you want to strengthen, or are you rereading it because it's the only thing you have control over right now?" She was quiet for a moment. "Both." He pulled out a stool and sat at the island. "Show me the part you're worried about." She sat across from him and showed him the section. The chain of custody on the contractor's testimony, the procedural documentation of how the evidence had been obtained, the places where a careful attorney could raise questions about methodology. He read it. She watched him read it. "What does your counsel say about these specific sections?" he said. "That they're defensible." "Then they're defensible. Defensible in litigation. This isn't litigation, it's a board review. Eleanor doesn't need a legal standard, she needs to be convinced." Ariana looked at the pages. "She's 71 years old, and she built her career on institutional integrity. If she reads this section and feels like she's being given a technically adequate argument rather than a true one, she's going to hesitate." He thought about that. "Is it a true one?" She looked at him. "The evidence is real. The methodology was not entirely conventional. But everything in this package happened. Everything you're asserting is accurate." "Yes." "Then it's a true argument." He held her gaze. "Eleanor Voss has been in business for 50 years. She knows the difference between a lie and a complicated path to the truth. She's not going to penalize you for the path if the destination is real." Ariana looked at the pages for a long moment. "You have a way of making things sound simpler than they are," she said. "I make them sound exactly as simple as they are," he said. "You're the one making them complicated." She looked up, and something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, not one. "That was almost rude," she said. "It was honest." He paused. "You're scared, and when you're scared, you find more work to do because work feels like control. I recognize it because I do the same thing." He said it plainly, without judgment, just one person naming what he saw in another person because he'd earned the right to see it. "You've done the work. It's done. Now we wait." She was quiet for a while. "I keep thinking about Marcus," she said finally. He let her have the space for it. "I know what he did," she said. "I've read the evidence 60 times. I know what he did. I understand why he did it in the abstract. The money, the control, the deal he probably made with Carlyle. I understand all of it." She turned her mug in her hands. A pause. "We ate lunch together for 8 years. He knew my sister's name. He came to the hospital when my mother had her hip surgery 3 years ago, and he sat with me for 4 hours in that waiting room." Landon didn't say anything. "I'm not excusing it," she said quickly. "I know you're not," he said. "You're grieving it. That's different." She looked at him. "You can know someone did something unforgivable and still grieve that they weren't who you thought they were," he said. "Those things aren't in conflict. You don't have to be angry every minute to know what it deserves." A silence. Something in her face shifted, the fine-grained tension around her eyes releasing a small degree. "You've been through something like this," she said. He thought about what to say. "Not this specific thing, but losing the version of a story you thought was true." "Yes." She didn't ask more than that. She understood the shape of what he wasn't saying. They stayed at the kitchen island for another hour, not going through the evidence package again, mostly just talking. About the board meeting, about Eleanor, about the things on the other side of this that neither of them had let themselves think about clearly because it required the belief that there was an other side. At some point, the conversation shifted away from all of it, the way it occasionally did, into the smaller, cleaner territory of ordinary things. She asked about Sophie's book report. He told her Sophie had chosen to write about a novel that technically wasn't on the approved list, but had made a compelling argument to Mrs. Hallstrom that her thematic analysis was more rigorous than the assigned text would have produced. "She's 8, Ariana said. "I know." Did she actually make the argument out loud to the teacher? Written note, 2 paragraphs. She included a citation. Ariana put her face in her hands in a way that was unmistakably delighted. "I didn't raise her to do that," Landon said. "She arrived like that. I'm just the person who keeps her clothed and fed." "You're more than that," Ariana said, and she said it directly, without the qualifying softness that people sometimes added to things like that. Not a compliment designed to receive something back. Just a fact, stated. He looked at her across the island. "I know," he said. "I'm getting better at knowing that." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked at the window, at the city below, and something about her face in that moment, the tiredness and the worry, and underneath it the specific quality of someone who had done the right thing and was waiting to find out if it would be enough, made him want to say something he wasn't going to say tonight because tonight was not the right time. He stored it for later. He was getting more certain that later existed. "You should sleep," he said. "I won't." "Try anyway." She walked him to the door. She was going to say something. He could see the shape of it forming. And then she looked at him, and what she actually said was, "Thank you for coming." "Yeah," he said. "Not just tonight. For all of it." She looked at him steadily. "I know what it cost you. I know what you put on the line. I want you to know that I—" She stopped, reorganized. "I don't take it lightly. You and Sophie. I don't take any of it lightly." "I know," he said. "Do you?" "Yes," he said. "I know because you said it like it mattered to you, and you don't say things like that to cover the space. You say them when they're true." She was quiet for a moment with that. "Go home," she said. "Get some sleep." He went home. He did not get much sleep, but he got some, and the apartment was quiet in its wrong daytime way, and he lay in the dark and thought about tomorrow. Eleanor Voss filed her ruling at 8:53 the next morning. Landon read it in Garrett's summary. The disqualification motion was approved for board consideration on grounds of sufficient documented evidence of conflict of interest. Board members Reeves and Park were suspended from voting privileges pending a full governance review. The emergency session called by their proxy was invalidated on procedural grounds. He sat at the kitchen table and read it twice. Then he called Ariana. She answered before the first ring completed, which meant she'd been watching her phone. Her voice, when she spoke, had a quality he'd never heard in it before. Stripped of the management layer, the containment layer, everything she usually kept as infrastructure between herself and the thing she was feeling. "It's done," she said. "I know," he said. "I just read it." A silence that had nothing in it except the specific texture of relief, which was different from joy, quieter, heavier, more like a structure that had been holding weight finally being able to rest. "It's not completely done," she said, pulling herself back to the operational frame. "The board meeting still happens. The vote still happens. We still have to—" "Ariana," he said. "What?" "Stop for 1 minute." She stopped. "It's done," he said again, gentler this time. "Take 1 minute." A long pause. "Okay," she said quietly. He sat at the kitchen table in his empty apartment and she sat wherever she was. And they were both quiet for 60 seconds, which was not very long and was also, given everything, exactly enough. "I need to call outside counsel," she said. "I know." "And Diana, and I know." "Thank you," she said. "Stop thanking me," he said. "I'm going to keep thanking you, Landon. You might as well accept it." He almost said something. He let it go. "Go call your lawyer." "I'll call you later. I'll be here," he said. She hung up. He sat in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window and the city going about its ordinary business outside and the apartment quiet around him, and he thought about all of it. The Meridian room and the blizzard and the navy blazer and the parking garage and the coffee shop and Sophie's gray-green eyes saying, "Be careful, Dad," at the door at 6:40 in the morning. And he thought about what came next. He called Sophie. She answered on the third ring. "Is it over?" she said, because she was Sophie and she had clearly understood more than he'd told her. "Getting there," he said. "Can I come home?" "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll drive up and get you." A pause. "Is Ariana okay?" He looked at the window. "Yeah," he said. "She is." "Good," Sophie said. And then, with the particular decisiveness she used when she'd settled something in her own mind, "I like her, Dad." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "You like her too." It wasn't a question. He didn't answer it as one. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said. "Do your book report." "I already turned it in." "Of course you did." Mrs. Hallstrom said the citation was unnecessary, but appreciated. "Of course she did." He hung up and sat in the apartment, and the morning light moved across the floor in the way it did this time of year, slow and pale and honest, and the city outside went on being the city, and he sat inside the quiet and felt, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, like the ground under him was solid enough to build something on. He wasn't sure yet what he was going to build. He was, for the first time in a long time, not afraid to find out. The board meeting happened 9 days later. It was not the emergency session Carlyle had tried to force. It was the regular session, now carried out under significantly altered conditions, with Reeves and Park suspended, with Carlyle's communications entered as evidence into the governance review, with Philip Carlyle himself declining to attend in person on the advice of counsel that outside counsel reported with a particular clipped satisfaction that Ariana recognized as the professional equivalent of a victory lap. Marcus Vail resigned the morning of the board meeting. He sent no letter, no statement, no communication to Ariana directly. His assistant sent a 2-line email to HR, and that was it. 8 years, 400 employees, a company built from nothing on borrowed server time and napkin math, and it ended in 2 lines from an assistant. Ariana sat with that for a morning, and then she filed it in the same place she'd filed the grief of it weeks ago, because she had already done that work and doing it again wasn't going to produce new results. The board meeting lasted 6 hours. The governance restructure motion failed 4-3, with Reeves and Park's suspended votes not counted. Ariana retained full executive authority. The board passed, unanimously, a resolution to refer the documented conspiracy evidence to federal authorities for review. When it was over, she walked out of the Stellarian boardroom and into the hallway, and she stood against the wall and she breathed, just breathed. Diana appeared at her shoulder with a bottle of water and the look of someone who had been holding an enormous amount together for a very long time and was also privately exhaling. "How are you?" Diana said. "I don't know yet," Ariana said. "Ask me in a week." Diana handed her the water. "Landon called," she said. "He said he didn't want to interrupt, but he wanted you to know he was thinking about you." Ariana looked at the bottle of water in her hands. "Tell him—" She stopped. Thought. "Tell him I'll call him tonight." "I already told him you'd call," Diana said. "He said he'd be home." She looked at Diana. Diana's expression was professionally neutral and had been for 20 years, but there was something at the edges of it that Ariana recognized as the particular expression of someone watching something they'd been hoping for finally starting to happen. "Don't," Ariana said. "I didn't say anything," Diana said. "Your face said something." "My face is a professional instrument," Diana said, and walked away. Ariana stood in the hallway with her water and the aftermath of 6 hours of boardroom combat settling through her. And she thought about calling him, and she thought about Sophie coming home from the cabin, and she thought about what came next. Not the company, not the legal proceedings, not the foundation idea that had been forming at the back of her mind for weeks, but the other thing. The thing she'd been storing in the same part of herself where he stored things that needed more time. She thought it might be time. She pushed off the wall and walked back toward the elevator, and the city was visible through the glass walls of the hallway, gray and alive and moving, and she walked through it toward whatever was next with the particular feeling of someone who had survived something that was supposed to stop her and hadn't, and who understood, maybe for the first time, that surviving was only the beginning of the thing. He drove up to the cabin the morning after the board meeting. It was a 4-hour drive through country that got progressively quieter. The city giving way to suburbs, the suburbs giving way to the kind of mid-distance towns that existed primarily to provide gas stations and diners to people passing through. And then the towns giving way to road and tree and the particular quality of winter light in the mountains that was different from city light in a way Landon had always found difficult to name. Cleaner? Maybe. Less apologetic. He hadn't slept well. He hadn't expected to. The board meeting's outcome had moved through him more slowly than he'd expected. Not the rush of relief he'd anticipated, but something quieter and more complicated. The gradual decompression of someone who had been braced for impact for so long that the absence of impact felt disorienting. He'd sat in his apartment until midnight, talking to Ariana on the phone in the meandering, uncalculated way they talked when there was nothing tactical left to discuss. She'd told him about the boardroom. He'd told her about the drive he was planning in the morning. They'd talked past midnight without either of them noticing, and when he finally said goodnight, his voice had the particular hoarseness of a man who had talked more that evening than he usually did in a week. He drove through the mountains with the radio off and thought about the last 3 months, the version of his life that had existed before the Whitmore Grand, the apartment, the job, the Sophie-shaped center around which everything else arranged itself. That life had been real, and it had been his, and he had not been unhappy in it. He wanted to be clear about that, even just to himself. He had not been waiting to be rescued from anything. He had not been half a person looking for the missing part of himself. He had been a complete person, or close enough to complete, doing the work of being a father and a man, and someone who paid his own bills and drove to 4 stores for craft foam without complaint. He had not needed saving. And yet, he turned off the state highway onto the access road that Nolan had sent him directions for, and the trees closed in on both sides and the road turned from asphalt to packed gravel and then to something that was arguably neither. And he thought about Ariana sitting across from him in a coffee shop for the first time with Sophie between them. And he thought about her voice in a parking garage saying, "I think the thing at Aspen Ridge wasn't an accident." And he thought about the way she'd said, "I'm scared." Not managed, not contained, just the plain 2-word fact of it. And the way that had landed in him like something he'd been waiting to catch without knowing he was waiting. He didn't need saving, but he had been, for 4 years, very alone in the kind of way that became invisible once you got used to it. The way a sound that plays long enough stops registering as sound and just becomes the texture of the air. He had stopped registering his own loneliness. She had made him hear it again, without meaning to, just by being the kind of person she was. Sharp and scared and brilliant and imperfect. Someone who said things that were true rather than things that were easy. Someone who could sit in a parking garage at 10:30 at night because the penthouse felt like a box and the city felt unmanageable. And sometimes the only honest response to your life is to drive until you feel like a person again. He understood that. He understood it specifically, not theoretically. He had driven those drives. The cabin appeared around a bend in the road. It was smaller than he'd imagined from Ariana's description, which was to say it was modest rather than the rustic mountain estate the words, "I bought it at 23" had suggested. Weathered gray wood siding. A porch that ran the front width with 2 chairs on it that had not been sat in recently. A window on the upper floor with a lamp on in it, visible even in daylight. 2 cars in the clearing in front. Nolan's rental and a second vehicle that had been arranged for the week. Sophie appeared on the porch before he'd fully parked. She had her coat on, unzipped in the way he'd been asking her not to unzip it since October, and her hair was doing the thing it did when she'd been inside for several days and hadn't been attending to it, which was a state of benign chaos that she claimed she didn't care about and which Landon suspected was partially accurate. She stood on the porch steps and watched him park with the gray-green eyes and the particular stillness she had when she was managing a feeling she wasn't going to let herself show before she'd assessed the situation. He got out of the truck. She came down the steps and crossed the clearing at a pace that was technically not running but was not quite walking either, and she hit him at about sternum height and held on, and he put both arms around her and held her back, and neither of them said anything for a moment because neither of them needed to. "Hi," he said into the top of her head. "Hi," she said into his coat. They stayed like that for a moment that was long enough to be honest about what it was. Then Sophie pulled back and looked up at him with the assessment eyes. "You look tired." "I am tired." "Did it work?" "Yes," he said. "It worked." She nodded once, with the gravity of someone receiving a report they'd commissioned and find satisfactory. "Good," she said. "Nolan made pancakes this morning. There are leftovers. Are they good?" "Better than yours," she said, and went back up the porch steps. They stayed at the cabin one more night, which was not the plan, but which became the plan organically when Landon sat down on the porch in the afternoon with a cup of coffee and looked at the mountains and felt, for the first time in 3 months, no particular urgency about being anywhere else. Nolan, who had the quiet, self-contained quality of someone who had spent years knowing when his presence was needed and when it wasn't, made dinner and then occupied the upper floor with efficient invisibility. Sophie, who had apparently spent the week establishing a relationship with the very loud bird she'd mentioned in her text, spent an hour in the late afternoon sitting on the porch railing in a coat she had finally fully zipped, watching the tree line and explaining to Landon, with the authority of someone who had done research, that the bird was a Steller's jay, and it was not actually being aggressive, it was communicating, and the distinction mattered. "I know," Landon said. "Most people think it's being mean," she said. "But it's just loud. That's different." He looked at her. "When did you become an expert on Steller's jays?" "Tuesday," she said. "I had time." A pause. "Nolan has a bird book." "Nolan has a bird book. He has 3 kids. They like birds." She watched the tree line. "Dad?" "Yeah." "Are you going to keep helping Ariana? After all this?" He considered the question as it deserved to be considered. "I think so. Not the same way, just she's a person in my life now. I think she is." Sophie was quiet for a moment. "She's a person in my life too," she said carefully, not making it more than it was. "I know," he said. "I want her to stay," Sophie said, and she said it the way she said most things that were true and important to her. Directly, without drama, looking at the trees rather than at him, giving him the space to receive it without making it a moment. He sat with it. "So do I," he said. Sophie didn't respond to that. She watched her jay, which had reappeared in the lower branches of a pine, announcing itself loudly and without apology. She pulled her coat tighter against the mountain cold, and Landon sat beside her in the late afternoon light, and neither of them said anything more about it, because it had been said, and in this family saying the thing once was enough. Mick. Ariana came to the apartment 2 weeks after the board meeting. It was not a planned visit. It had started as a phone call. Landon calling to report that the federal referral had moved forward, that Carlisle had been contacted by investigators, that outside counsel was satisfied with the direction of the legal proceedings, and somewhere in the middle of it she'd said, "I want to see you," with the directness she had when she'd decided something. And he'd said, "Come over." And 40 minutes later she was at his door. She looked different than the last time he'd seen her in person, which had been the penthouse in the 48 hours before the board meeting. The compressed spring quality was gone. She was still herself, still the particular brand of alert that seemed to be structural rather than situational. But the edge that had been underneath everything for months, the edge of a person braced and braced and bracing, had softened into something else. She was wearing jeans and a plain jacket, and she had a bag that appeared to contain takeout containers from a Thai place he actually liked, which told him either she'd done research or she'd gotten lucky. "I didn't know what you'd want," she said at the door, holding up the bag. "That's from Lotus on 7th, he said. "Is it good?" "It's my favorite Thai place." She looked at the bag. Diana may have had input. "I like Diana," he said, and stepped back to let her in. Sophie was at the kitchen table doing homework, and she looked up when Ariana came in and did the assessment and then said hi, with the particular warmth she extended to people she had already decided about. Ariana said hi back and asked about the book report, and Sophie said Mrs. Hallstrom had returned it with a comment that said, "Unconventional but well argued," which Sophie had decided to interpret as a compliment, and Ariana said she thought that was exactly right. They ate dinner at the kitchen table, all 3 of them, takeout containers open in the middle, and the conversation moved the way it did when people didn't need to perform comfort because the comfort was already there. Sophie talked about a project on ecosystems she was starting, distinct from the previous diorama. This one focused on rainforest layers and already involving plans for a 3-dimensional structure that Landon had quietly begun dreading. Ariana asked intelligent questions about the canopy layer versus the understory, and Sophie was visibly pleased at the precision of the engagement. At some point, Landon looked up from his food and caught Ariana looking at him in the particular way she had when she thought he wasn't watching. a look that was direct and a little unguarded, and that she quickly redirected to her food when she realized he'd seen it. He didn't say anything. He filed it with the other things he was ready to say. After dinner, Sophie announced that she was going to do another 30 minutes of homework and then read, which was her way of giving notice that she was removing herself from the conversation, which Landon recognized as an act of social grace from an 8-year-old and filed under evidence that she was, in fact, going to be fine in the world. He and I not on, and the city outside doing its city things, and the apartment warm and slightly cluttered in the comfortable way it got when someone actually lived in it, and for a while neither of them said anything, which was something they had both gotten good at. The comfortable kind of not speaking, the kind that meant neither person was waiting for the other one to fill the space. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "I know." She looked at him. "You can't know. I haven't said it yet." "You've been thinking about it for a while," he said. "You get a specific expression." "What expression?" "Like you're running an argument and the argument keeps coming out the same way and you're deciding whether to trust it." She was quiet for a moment. "That's uncomfortably accurate." "I know." She turned toward him slightly, the way she did when she was going to say a real thing. "I've been thinking about the foundation." He waited. "The idea I've had. Emergency response training for the public, childcare assistance for single parents, financial support for families in crisis." She looked at her hands. "I've been running the numbers and the structure and I know how to build it. That part's straightforward. I've built things before. But the part I keep coming back to is the why." She paused. "I've built things for strategy before, for market position, for the story it tells about the company. This is the first thing I've wanted to build because it matters regardless of what it does for me." "I know that," he said. "I know you know." She looked at him steadily. "I want you to be involved, not as a figurehead, not as the human interest story. I want you to help design the emergency response training component. You know things that I don't know and that most people in my world don't know. You've been the person who shows up first. You know what that actually looks like and what it costs." He sat with that. "I have a job," he said. "I know." "And Sophie." "I know. I'm not asking you to change your life." A pause. "I'm asking if there's room in your life for this." He looked at the window. Thought about Sophie's Stellar's J and its loud, unapologetic communication. Thought about the drive up the mountain, the gravel road, the way the trees closed in. Thought about the 4 stores for craft foam and the hot chocolate in the coffee shop and the phone calls at midnight and the sound of her voice in a parking garage and all the accumulated weight of the last 3 months, which was the heaviest and most alive he'd felt since Claire. "There's room," he said. She nodded slowly, processing. "There's something else," he said. She looked at him. "I want to say the thing I've been not saying." He said it plainly because he was not good at build-up and because she deserved the plain version. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm not presenting an ultimatum or a condition. I'm just saying it because it's true, and I've been deciding whether to trust it for a while now." He looked at her. "I'm in love with you. I've known it for about 6 weeks. I didn't say it because the timing was wrong and because you had enough to manage, and because I needed to be sure it wasn't, that it was what it actually is, and not just the situation, that it wasn't the adrenaline or the proximity or the shared crisis." He paused. "It's not any of those things. It's you. Specifically you." Ariana was very still. "It's the way you said you didn't know yet when I asked why you kept picking up," he said. "It's the way you told Sophie that yes, it was lonely without hedging it or dressing it up. It's the way you drive around a parking garage at 10:30 at night because you need the city to feel manageable. It's the way you ran back through 8 years of a friendship and refused to lie to yourself about what you found, even though lying would have been easier." He stopped. "You're not easy. You're not convenient. You are genuinely one of the most complicated people I've met, and I want to be someone in your life, properly, if that's something you want." The apartment was very quiet. Ariana looked at him for a long moment, and he watched her face move through things the way it moved through things when she wasn't managing it. Not performed, not composed for an audience, just a person who had been surprised by something in the direction they'd hoped for, and was catching up to it. "I've been in love with you," she said, "since you told me you'd left your jacket on purpose." He blinked. "I didn't say I left it on purpose." "You said you didn't go back for it." The smallest lift at the corner of her mouth. "Same thing. You walked away from a blizzard without looking back. Into the storm. I'd never seen anyone do that." She shook her head slightly. "And then you showed up at a coffee shop in the actual jacket, and it really wasn't very impressive, and I thought, this person is exactly who he appears to be. He's not performing anything. That's just who he is." He was quiet. "That's not something I know how to find," she said. "I know how to find competence. I know how to find intelligence. I know how to find ambition. I do not know how to find a person who is simply, entirely themselves, without apology, without performance." She looked at him. "I didn't know I was looking for it. I found it anyway." He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, not in the performed way of a gesture designed to be remembered. He just reached across the couch and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat in the apartment with the city outside and the quiet inside, and Sophie in the next room doing homework on an ordinary Thursday evening, and it was not cinematic, it was not polished, it was imperfect in every logistical way. A single father with a bad carpet and a water heater that needed replacing. A billionaire who didn't know how to stop working long enough to want something for herself, and 8 years of separate grief between them, and 1,000 unresolved practical questions about what this looked like in the real world. But his hand around hers was warm and certain, and it meant what it meant. That was enough for right now. The foundation launched 7 months later. Ariana named it the First Response Foundation, and the name was plain in the way she'd been learning to let things be plain. No branding exercise, no consultant suggestion, just the accurate description of the thing it was for. The gala opening was held in a ballroom that was considerably less fraught than the last ballroom any of them had been in together. And Ariana stood at the podium and spoke without notes because she'd decided she was done speaking from prepared text about things she actually meant. She talked about the work the foundation would do, funding emergency response training programs in underserved communities, building childcare support networks for single parents who were surviving on the narrow edge between staying afloat and going under, creating emergency financial assistance for families in crisis who fell through the gaps of every existing system. She talked about the gap between the people who knew how to help and the situations that needed help, and how most of that gap wasn't a gap in intention, but a gap in training and resources and the simple practical infrastructure of showing up. She did not tell the story of the Meridian Room. She didn't reference Aspen Ridge or the blizzard or the man in the navy blazer. She had decided that was a private story, not a brand narrative, and that the foundation would stand on what it was rather than on the story of how it came to be. What she said, near the end, was this: "The most important things I've learned in the last year were not in any boardroom. They were in a coffee shop and in a parking garage, and on the phone at midnight, and in an apartment with bad carpet. They were taught to me, mostly without anyone intending to teach me, by a man who rushes toward emergencies and an 8-year-old girl who tells the truth without permission." She paused. "I built companies because I wanted to build something that lasted. I understand now that the things that last aren't the structures. They're the people inside them. If this foundation does one thing, I want it to be this: remind people that showing up is not extraordinary. It should be ordinary. It can be ordinary if we decide to build a world where the tools are available. That's what we're here to build." Landon, sitting in the third row with Sophie beside him, did not look like a man at a gala. He was wearing a jacket that was better than the navy blazer, but still not trying very hard. And Sophie was in a dress she had agreed to under negotiated conditions that had included a later bedtime and full approval over the restaurant they went to afterward. And he watched Ariana at the podium and felt something that he had no interest in reducing to language because language would have made it smaller. Sophie leaned against his arm. "She's good at this," she said quietly. "Yeah," he said, "but she's better in the coffee shop." He looked down at her, the gray-green eyes, direct and sure. He thought about Claire, the way he still thought about Claire, not with the raw edge of the early years, but with the particular quality of a love that had become part of his structure rather than part of his wound. He thought about what Claire would have made of all this. The Whitmore Grand, the parking garage, Ariana's hand in his on an ordinary Thursday, the foundation's name in plain letters on a banner over a stage. He thought Claire would have been unsurprised. He thought she would have looked at him with the gray-green eyes their daughter had inherited and said, "What took you so long?" "Yeah," he said to Sophie. "She's better in the coffee shop." Sophie nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already known, and went back to watching the stage. After the event, when the room had thinned and the catering staff had begun the quiet efficiency of a cleanup, the three of them stood outside on a terrace that looked over the February night. Sophie had her coat zipped, which Landon noted with private satisfaction. Ariana had her arm through his, something she'd started doing in recent months, with the ease of something that had always been there. And the city below them was doing what the city always did, moving, breathing, indifferent and enormous and full of people going about the ordinary work of their lives. "Can we get burgers?" Sophie said. Ariana looked at her. "After a gala dinner?" "The food was good, but there wasn't enough of it," Sophie said. "They did very small portions. It was a gala." "That's not a food philosophy. That's an event type," Sophie said. Landon said nothing. He was committed to not taking sides in this particular category of exchange, which had become something he actively enjoyed witnessing. Ariana looked at him. "You're not helping." "I'm staying out of it." "Dad agrees with me," Sophie said, without evidence and with total conviction. "I didn't say—" "He has the face he makes when he agrees but doesn't want to say so," Sophie said. "I know that face." Ariana looked at him. He attempted neutrality. She studied his face for a moment and then said, "She's right. You do have a face." "I don't have a face." "You have a very specific face," Ariana said. "Dad," Sophie said, "let's get burgers." He stood on the terrace in the February cold with his daughter on one side and Ariana's arm through his, and the city spread out below them in all its complicated lit-up existence, and he thought about the word family. Not in the clean version where everyone is whole and nothing is missing, but in the real version, where the people in it carry their separate scars and their separate histories and their separate ways of being afraid, and choose each other anyway, imperfectly, on an ongoing basis, without guarantees. He thought about what it cost to love people, the specific vulnerability of it, the way it made the world feel larger and more dangerous and more worth being in, all at once. He had been afraid, after Claire, that he would run the math on that cost and decide it was too high, that the thing he'd learned from loss was to protect himself by wanting less. He had been wrong about that, or rather, he had been right that the cost was real and high and not something you got around. He had been wrong about what that meant. The cost wasn't a reason to want less. It was proof that the thing had value. You didn't count the cost of something that didn't matter. He looked at Sophie, who was already making the specific face she made when she thought a decision was going her way. And he looked at Ariana, who was looking at him with the look she had when she wasn't managing herself. And he thought, this is the thing. This ordinary cold terrace, these two people, the city below, the prospect of burgers at 9:30 at night. This is the thing that the boards and the battles and the blizzard were all in the service of, though none of them could have known it at the time. This is the thing. "Burgers," he said. Sophie raised a fist in the quietly triumphant way she had. Ariana leaned into him slightly. "There's a place I know on 5th, she said. "Good fries, late hours." "Of course you know a place," he said. "I know a lot of places," she said. "That's one of the things I bring to this arrangement." "One of them," he agreed. They went inside to get their coats. Later, much later, after the burgers and the fries and Sophie falling asleep in the back of the car on the drive home and having to be carried inside, which she was technically too old for and which she submitted to with the dignity of someone choosing not to make an issue of it, Landon stood at the kitchen window with a last cup of coffee and the city quiet outside and the apartment warm behind him. Ariana was on the couch with her shoes off and a glass of water reading something on her phone, and he turned and looked at her from the kitchen, and she looked up, and their eyes met across the apartment, and neither of them said anything, and it was the kind of ordinary moment that had no drama in it and no significance except everything. He thought about the night of the blizzard, the Meridian room, the woman on the floor, and the instinct that had moved him across the room before he'd made a decision, the jacket he'd left behind. The storm he'd walked back into without looking over his shoulder. He had not been looking for this. He had not been waiting for this. He had just been there, in the right place, doing the only thing he knew how to do, which was show up when something needed doing and stay present in his own life, even when it was hard, and love the people in his care with everything he had. He had just been himself, and it had led without plan or design or anyone's intention to this kitchen, this apartment, this woman on his couch, this daughter asleep in the next room, this future that none of them had engineered and all of them had somehow, in their separate ways, been moving toward. There was something in that worth understanding, something that sat underneath the love story and the corporate conspiracy and the mountain cabin and all of it. Something smaller and more important than any of those things. You didn't find the life you wanted by designing it. You found it by being honest about who you were and what you could offer and what you needed, and by showing up when showing up was hard, and by being present in the ordinary, unremarkable moments that looked like nothing and were actually everything. By not walking away from things that scared you, by not waiting for the right time or the perfect version or the guaranteed outcome, by rushing toward the thing in the storm, even when you didn't know what it was, even when the room was full of people standing still. Most people stood still. The difference between the life you had and the life you wanted was usually just that, the willingness to move. Landon turned back to the window and looked at the city, and then looked back at Ariana on the couch, and she was already looking at him. And she lifted an eyebrow that said, "What are you thinking about?" And he shook his head slightly in the way that meant nothing, or everything, I'll tell you later. And she held his gaze for a moment, and then went back to her phone. He drank his coffee. The snow was starting again outside, light and steady, the kind that didn't announce itself. The kind that covered everything quietly, without drama, while no one was watching. He watched it fall. He thought about a stranger in a blizzard, and a life that had changed in the time it took to cross a room, and how the things that mattered almost never announced themselves. They just arrived in the middle of ordinary evenings, dressed in unremarkable jackets, moving toward the thing that needed doing. He thought, I have been the luckiest unlucky man alive. He thought, Sophie's going to ask for a dog next. He finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, and went to sit beside Ariana on the couch. And she moved over without being asked and leaned into him without ceremony. And the city outside kept going, and the snow kept falling, and the apartment held them all in its imperfect walls. It was not a perfect life. It was, without question, the right one.